Okay, well, welcome everybody. My name's Mark Walker from AbilityNet. It's 1 minute past one, I think, so we're going to get rolling. We've got a webinar today which will take about 30 minutes of presentation materials and a chance for questions at the end. This whole webinar will be recorded and will be available afterwards. One of the advantages of that is we then take a transcript of the webinar and provide it as captions. So if there's anything that you miss, or if you're having trouble with any of the technology, or there's any point where you're finding it difficult to follow, a full transcript is provided afterwards, and that will be available as a text file as well as captions on a video. So I've got two colleagues with me, and we're going to introduce ourselves in a second. The first thing I want to do, though, is just make sure that the technology is working for people. Could you please use the questions or answers, or it says questions. Could you tell me that you can hear me? Could you, anybody who can hear me, please type into the questions box on the control panel that they can hear me. Yes, yes, thanks, Maren. Yes, D. Oh, hi, Maren. And Claire, yes, great. Thank you, everybody. Perfect. And just to check the other technologies working, I'm just going to get you to tell me where you're calling from. I'm going to launch a poll. So a poll should pop up on your screen. May or may not be accessible to every screen reader. Most should see that, we think, but it's asking you whether you're in the UK or in Europe, Asia, US, or anywhere else. So if you can let us know where in the world you are, that would be great. And also, that's a good way of checking that the polls work. We'll use the polls a couple of times again in the next half an hour, just to provide a bit of interaction, if nothing else, and to make sure that we know you're still out there. So 85% of you have voted in the poll. I'm going to close it in another 10 seconds. I'll have given you 40, 50 seconds. And it turns out that all of you are in the UK, or all the people who've replied are in the UK. And hopefully, I can't see what you can see about the poll, but hopefully you can see the results there now, that everybody's from the UK. So later on, we'll ask another couple of questions, and again, we'll be able to share the answers with you as part of what we're doing during the webinar. Great, so let's get on with the show. I've got two colleagues with me, Robin from AbilityNet and Kate from Clear. I'll ask them to introduce themselves. My name is Mark Walker. I'm the marketing manager at AbilityNet, and I host the webinars for AbilityNet. We do at least one or two webinars every month, and so we have lots of different online content. And if you haven't seen any of the other webinars that we have, you'll see along the bottom of the screen here, abilitynet.org.uk/webinars is where we maintain a list of upcoming events and an archive of the stuff we've done recently. So, Robin, could you briefly introduce yourself and say what your role is at AbilityNet?
Yes, thank you, Mark. Hello, everybody. My name's Robin Christopherson, and I'm Head of Digital Inclusion at AbilityNet. So I do a lot of public speaking, advocacy type activities, and try to keep abreast of all the latest developments in tech and disability.
Great, thank you. And Kate, could you introduce yourself? Tell us a bit about your role at Clear Company.
I can. Welcome, everybody. Yeah, my name's Kate Headley. I'm the Director of Consulting at the Clear Company. And my role essentially is to ensure that the development products and services at the Clear Company are in line with best practice. I'm also a prolific speaker, and I advise on a number of government and employer-led forums to identify and remove barriers for recruitment and retention of disabled people, which is my passion in life.
Great, thank you very much. And we're going to find out a little bit more about the Clear Company in a second, so we'll come to that. So today's session is about disability, technology, reasonable adjustment. It's particularly thinking about the needs of HR professionals, although others, I can see from the registration details that we've received that others are interested for a number of reasons. We're going to cover 5 areas, and there are 6 parts to it, to what we're doing today. The first is we're going to look at understanding disability, what we mean by disability, some of the common language that we have, and also some of the questions that we have about how people describe and use the word disability. We're going to talk about what is a reasonable adjustment. Kate's going to tell us about her experience of the challenges that employers face in fulfilling reasonable adjustments for their employees. And we're going to introduce Clear Talents, which is a tool that we use within the service that we do, that we provide in AbilityNet, which I think people will be interested in. We're going to look at some common reasonable adjustments, and then we're going to take questions and answers. So in terms of housekeeping, you're very welcome to ask questions as we go along. I'll try to keep track of those. Kate and Robin are going to be doing most of the talking. I'm going to be doing the joining up bits. So if you have questions, please ask them. Please use the question and answer section on the control panel if you can. You can use the chat as well, although it turns out I can only have one thing open at a time here, so I'll be juggling them back and forth, but depending on which one's easier for you. If you have any questions at all at any time, post them up there. If they reply to something immediately, I'll ask the question then, but it may be that something comes to you and we can ask the questions at the end, and I'll try and round up all the things that you have as any issues that you've picked up along the way. Bit of background about AbilityNet in case you don't know us. We're a charity. We provide commercial services which fund our charitable services, and we provide them to a whole range of different customers. We have a workplace assessment service, and that's about providing reasonable adjustments within the workplace. We also provide free IT support to disabled people. We have a home visit service with a network of volunteers. IT can help volunteers who can go into disabled people's homes and help them with their computers. We have tools like My Computer, My Way. We're going to mention that later on, which is a free online service. And we also have accessibility services helping make websites and apps and other digital tools and services accessible. So we provide a range of different services. The Clear Company, Kate, if you could tell us a little bit about the Clear Company, particularly its background, about where it comes from and what you've done to date.
Yeah, definitely. The Clear Company is predominantly an inclusive recruitment solutions and consulting business. Our background is that we all worked in recruitment, and I lead the consulting team. I'm HR director by profession. And essentially, we identify the barriers, working closely with organisations, and then we work with them on a very practical level to put in place solutions and empower them to remove those barriers. We run a range of very large-scale initiatives. One is the Recruitment Industry Disability Initiative, which is a real passion of mine, to embed best practice across the recruitment industry around disability. We run research in that space every 2 years as well. And we have a number of products and services that employers can then take and use for themselves to ensure that they are comfortable and confident in this space. And we'll maybe talk a little bit about what those needs are with employers later on during the webinar.
Great, thank you. And thank you very much for all your help in getting this webinar together as well. I know that it's going to be really valuable. So let's start with Robin. You're going to tell us a bit about disability. It's an area where I think some people have a lot of knowledge and some people have very little. So could you just sort of talk us through some of the things we need to know about in terms of disability?
Absolutely, thanks, Mark. So it makes sense to start with the Equality Act 2010 and the code of practice that accompanies the Equality Act. Has a definition of disability. So disability is obviously a very important area of addressing a diverse workforce, so it's important to start off with a clear idea of what that is. So in the Act it talks about a person having a disability if they've got a physical or mental impairment, and that's quite a blunt instrument when it comes to defining what's covered in the Act, but rest assured that does cover, the physical covers all of the physical impairments plus sensory impairments, hearing and seeing and that sort of thing. And a mental impairment covers everything in the cognitive realm, including dyslexia if it's severe enough, autism, mental health conditions as well. So those are covered by what a disability is. But the key thing is the next bullet point, which is that it has to have a substantial and long-term adverse effect on the individual in their ability to undertake normal day-to-day activities. So the severity of the impairment in those above kind of categories is the key differentiator when it comes to saying whether someone has disability. At AbilityNet, we certainly don't make a distinction between somebody who's got a registered disability, with a capital D, or any other kind of impairment. It could be that they have even a very short-term impairment like a broken wrist or something. There's always some adjustments that can be made, and absolutely the same should apply in your thinking about your workforce. So whilst there is a legal obligation to consider people with a long-term difficulty, you absolutely want to be agile enough and certainly thinking in the terms of catering for everybody in a very sort of agile, flexible way. If we go on to the next slide. So this slide covers sort of a twin approach to categorization of impairment. This is purely sort of to give you a flavour of how straightforward it is to sort of categorize this. So for AbilityNet's purposes, when we do disabled user testing, for example, and certainly in My Computer My Way, which is a really excellent online resource that we'll have a look at later on, we tend to categorize impairment as motor, vision, hearing, and cognitive. So for the purposes of the main areas of adjustment, we would look at all the different spectrum of impairments quite neatly coming under those 4 categories. Under the Equality Act, and here we've got a really key phrase here, which is to preempt, plan, and prepare. So I think Kate's going to talk a lot more about how the best practice approach that HR can take to this, to approaching the challenge of diversity and best practice in this area. And planning and being preemptive is absolutely a key facet to that. But they've got the same basic 4 categories, but you'll see there they've also got mental health and facial disfigurement. So they've got broadly the same approach. When it comes to testing website accessibility and software accessibility and app accessibility, which is what a lot of what AbilityNet does, as well as workplace assessments, these 2 last categories we're not able to test, or they don't have an impact on accessing websites or apps, so those why they're not included in our 4 categories. But as we'll look at later on with My Computer My Way, there's an awful lot that can be done to adjust your technology freely, quickly, to help in those areas. We go on to the next slide. So here we've got some statistics about the prevalence of disability in the UK. So 20% of employees will have a disability of some kind, and that is actually disability with a capital D, so recognised under the Discrimination Act, long-term, under the Equality Act, sorry, long-term impact on their work. 10 million people in the UK have a hearing impairment, and that's right across the spectrum, so they might be registered disabled because of it, or it might be age-related hearing loss. They might have gone to too many rock concerts in the 70s or whatever. So there's a huge number of people for whom you need to consider the impact of that impairment in the workplace. Dyslexia is a very significant size of the UK population, 10%, 6 million, and 4% of those, well, 4 million of those will have severe dyslexia. So that is a very significant statistic. There's another statistic that we haven't got up here, which is that actually a quarter of the population, 25%, have a sub-14 literacy age, which is a real eye-opening statistic. And the workforce will reflect that to a greater or lesser extent, but it will be around that sort of figure. And the actual official figure when it comes to registered disabled is around 11 million, 11.2 million people.
Robin, could I just ask you, you mentioned earlier...
It is a workforce issue.
Sorry, Robin, could I just interrupt? There was a question came in. Just somebody said, could you clarify, earlier you said dyslexia if severe enough. And you mentioned severity of dyslexia there. Do you have a particular version of how severe dyslexia is when it becomes severe enough to record in the way you just said? Is there a difference between that sort of 4 million and 6 million?
I don't know exactly how it's defined as severe. That's from the British Dyslexia Association, so we would have to see how they do that. Okay. It would have to be really very severe for it to be, a recognised impairment that you would, receive benefits for. But it doesn't, because it's a spectrum condition, like so many others. We would see a spectrum of adjustments, and certainly under the Equality Act, what is reasonable scales up with the severity of the impairment and various other factors, but we'll come on to talk about that a little bit more later on.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for that question. So yeah, 50% of people who acquire a disability actually do so, during their working life. So that's a really significant issue. And people tend to think of, and the wheelchair symbol, the symbol for disability, is probably could do with perhaps being rethought, because less than 8% of people, or around 8% of people who have a disability, actually use a wheelchair. So that's a very, very small portion. But every day people are associating that very strongly in their minds with disability, to the extent that blind people, for example, are forced into wheelchairs to be taken across the tarmac to airplanes, etc., because it's so sort of ingrained in people's mindset that they have to be contained, and they have to be, that's a reasonable adjustment equals a wheelchair, regardless of the disability in the most extreme cases. So on the next slide, we've just got some benefits, the business case in essence, for putting in place these reasonable adjustments, before we kind of get on to some of the meat about what they might be. And these are all health and safety executive stats, and it's absolutely true that if your employees have the right adjustments in place to overcome their impairments, then they will be as productive as their able-bodied peers. It will increase the staff loyalty. They'll stay longer in their jobs. Obviously, if the difficulties that they're having are so severe that they would need to end their employment, then because the reasonable adjustments haven't been made, then there's a very significant impact there. But if the right reasonable adjustments have been made, and you've taken the effort, and they feel supported, etc., then they are actually more loyal than people that didn't have that, or didn't need adjustments in place. They actually stay longer in their jobs. And obviously, a healthy workforce with the right adjustments in place is a much happier workforce, and well-being is a very significant factor in staff retention. And there are legal costs associated with not doing it properly, and we'll have a look at that on the next slide. Diversity and inclusion, is incredibly important, and the challenge is not insignificant, which is why we're doing this webinar today. But that's something that can absolutely be addressed with a best practice approach. So we'll go on to the next slide.
Robin, somebody just asked, could you repeat the statistic about literacy levels? I think you mentioned about the sub-14 year. What was that?
So 25%. And apologies, I'll dig out the source of it if people need it. But yeah, 25%, a quarter of the population has a sub-14 or below literacy age, reading age.
I assume by that you mean adults, because obviously there will be a certain proportion of people who are below 14 in the population.
There absolutely will be, and they are included in that. So I don't mean adults, I mean of the entire population.
Right.
But sub-14 of the entire population would be about 7 or 8% maybe.
Yeah.
So it's the other half that we're concerned about.
Yeah.
But obviously, if you're talking about how your communications with your stakeholders, with your customers, etc., you depending on what your objective is and your customer base is, you may well be speaking to sub-14-year-olds as well. So you need to get the it makes I mean, we all know about plain English, good use of straightforward language, etc., cutting down the amount of content that you put online, etc., would help all of those groups, regardless of their age.
Great, thank you.
So this figure, just over 22,000, was the average awarded in a tribunal under the Equality Act for disability discrimination, and we can see nearly £400,000 was the highest awarded in 2011-2012. So yeah, that was the sort of legal risk, which converts to obviously a financial risk, and also an incredibly poor risk, large risk when it comes to PR, etc., brand damage. So yeah, something to be avoided at all cost. And those figures, by the way, don't include settlements out of court, etc. So they're, you know, the prevalence, the frequency of those are much higher than those that go all the way through. And the last slide for me before you can hear somebody else's voice. So we've got some Chartered Institute of Professional Development numbers. So it's £8,000 to recruit and training a new person. So this comes back to staff retention being so important again. And the reasonable adjustments, we'll come on to how AbilityNet and their workplace assessments are a natural fit to help achieve best practice in this area. £300 to adjust equipment, provide a footrest, a lumbar support, and a different mouse, some special software to help with spelling or whatever it might be. The average cost there is £300, and that includes training, etc. So really very cheap when you stack it up against even just a couple of days being saved from being off sick or lack of productivity going forward. So that's quite enough from me.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Robin. And I think it's important, we do a lot of work in AbilityNet talking about disability, and we've deliberately covered a range of information there just to demonstrate how broad this topic is for us. We cover all disabilities, people of all ages, and it really does cover an awful lot of different ground. So moving on, Kate, could you tell us a bit about what, particularly starting with what the law defines, but equally just in terms of day-to-day, what is a reasonable adjustment? What do we mean by a reasonable adjustment?
Yes, certainly, Mark. Thank you. The lesson is in the wording, really. What is a reasonable adjustment? It's an adjustment that is reasonable, I suppose. The way it's defined in terms of the Equality Act and the way that recruiters and employers need to consider it is that it's basically making a change to the way employers and recruiters usually do things to ensure that disabled people are not unlawfully discriminated against. So that doesn't mean lowering the bar, significantly changing everything that you're doing so that it bears no resemblance to what you set out to achieve. It just means identifying where a barrier might lie. If we talk about the recruitment process, for example, is there a way that we're assessing or interviewing or asking people to travel to assessments or interviews that's nothing to do with their ability to perform the duties of the job, but is getting in the way of their ability to show us that they can do that? And we might make some adjustments to that along the way. The way that we define it is we depart from the usual practice and the way things are done. So if we're doing an online assessment, we might do an offline assessment, we might do a work-based exercise or a work sample, or a working interview, or an alternative assessment methodology, for example, would be a good way of describing the range of things that you can do. There is specialist equipment or additional support options, so either at work or in recruitment. That might be, as Robin says, using a different kind of mouse or a trackpad. It might be, I've got lots of equipment coming to help me because I have a visual impairment, so I'm getting a scanner that can translate things and transmit them onto my screen, which means I can read written material again, so that's exciting. Cost buttons and will change my life, and there's lots of other things around like that. And additional support might be, in the recruitment context, that might be somebody with dyslexia or somebody with autism, Asperger's, where, depending on the nature of the impact of their disability or impairment, it might just help to have something read out to them in terms of instructions rather than trying to read and absorb the instructions at the same time. It might just be having some emotional support in a stressful situation and enable somebody to perform at their best, which is clearly what we want. Or there are some more obvious practical support like travel buddies, or somebody to read for somebody. But as I like to say in terms of reasonable adjustments, I quote an employment lawyer friend of mine who says reasonable adjustments should be limited only by your imagination. And they need to remove the barriers, be they physical, cognitive, emotional, psychological. It doesn't really matter. From the Clear Company's perspective, the way to approach reasonable adjustments is to think, is there something getting in the way that I can reasonably remove that's going to enable me to ensure that my potential hire can shine in the recruitment process so I don't miss out on the talent, And for those of you who don't know, we are back in a war for talent, so it's pretty key that we don't miss out on any. And if I have an employee at work, I want them to fulfill their potential, I want them to be happy, and I want them to be safe. And I want them to stay, which obviously the first three things will enable them to do. And in terms of what is reasonable and what is not reasonable, if we go on to the next page, actually, Mark, if that's okay. The first question we're always asked about reasonable adjustments is what is reasonable and what isn't reasonable. And so before I just talk through these bullets, I'll position that. It's reasonable if it has the desired impact, that it's cost achievable, and that it basically does its job, and it's manageable within the resources and the time frame that you've got. So from a recruitment perspective, for example, if you're starting to consider putting a new lift into a building in order to accommodate a candidate coming for a potential job, it's probably stepping outside that realm of reasonableness, and you might just want to look at holding the interview in a different place as a simpler solution. So as soon as it feels overcomplicated and difficult, as soon as you're not talking to the individual concerned about whether it will have the desired impact and it's right for them, then the chances are that you're outside of the realms of reasonableness. So putting that into these challenges for employers, what employers tell us is, the first challenge they have is, if we're going to make adjustments, what do we do if somebody doesn't tell us? I'm sure that will resonate with the audience listening in today. So one of the keys is we have to create an environment of trust where people feel able to share information with us. And by that I mean some disabled people, a great number of disabled people, particularly in a recruitment context and in certain employers, might not feel comfortable or confident to share information about their disability. That might be from a privacy perspective, it might be from a concern about whether it might limit their ability to be promoted, give people a different view of them at work, or actually get them selected out of a job. And just to put that into real terms, we run a clear survey every 2 years. We did it again this year, and disabled candidates tell us that over 70% would not declare a disability at the beginning of a recruitment process, particularly with a recruitment agency. And they cite fear of not getting the job as the number one factor that's affecting that decision. And for 46% of those individuals, that's based on their experience. Whether that's perceived or actual is irrelevant. It's their experience. So we do have to create that environment of trust, and that's not about putting a strap line on a website saying, please let us know if you need any adjustments. That's not enough. What we need to do is go way beyond that in terms of saying the sort of adjustments we can make, the fact we're comfortable and confident to do so, some examples, case studies, role models. So the person looking at your website or talking to you as an employee genuinely feels that you're not just putting a strap line on about reasonable adjustments, that you know what you're talking about and you're committed to doing that for all the right reasons. So that's really, really key to create that environment of trust and to keep that trust going. And then, so we work with a number of organisations, so you create this environment of trust, people start to disclose, self-declare, and then of course the next situation is, how does the employer know how to respond to that confidently? So it's really important to put that competence in at hiring manager level, as well as HR, occupational health and recruitment, and with any partners and stakeholders who are part of that journey. So they know what adjustments to make, what questions to ask. And again, our disabled colleagues, particularly in the recruitment space, will tell us that one of the things that would make the biggest difference to them is if recruiters knew the right questions to ask at every stage in the recruitment process that enable them to confidently talk about the impact of the recruitment process for them and put those adjustments in place. And that comes into this whole disability confident category, and I'm sure many of you will be aware that the government's campaign currently is all around disability confidence. And what do we mean by that? We mean that we take away that fear that disempowers employers to have these conversations with potential hires and with their own colleagues. And that's about knowing the right thing to say, knowing when to say it, how to say it, what to ask, how to ask it, where to go for help, because we can't be a font of all knowledge against a spectrum as broad as the one that Robin has eloquently described already. So we need to get those HR staff and line managers and colleagues empowered. And that's not just about a disability awareness training course once a year, because 8 months later or 18 months later they might have the first opportunity to use that knowledge. So actually making sure that they have access to knowledge at the point of need is really key. So when that individual who has Asperger's or is talking about severe dyslexia says this is going to have an impact, then that's the point at which that manager needs to know what information they require, where to go for help, and what their options and adjustment options are for them, and not just fall into that. The only option we've got is extra time, which is actually becoming a barrier to broader level adjustments, as people think offering extra time means they've covered their bases. But for some people with dyslexia, you could offer them 2 weeks and it wouldn't make any difference, but give them a coloured overlay, for example, and it could make just the right impact. And that's certainly the case for some of my colleagues. So that's just to give you a little bit to think about there. If you want to move on to the next slide, Mark. Just introducing Clear Talents, which is something we've done in partnership with AbilityNet. We're incredibly proud of 3 years of research and development exploring those 2 main issues, which are how do we get people to tell us information, and how do we empower an organisation to confidently deliver behind that new information. So Clear Talents does just that. It sits at the front of your recruitment or in your employment portal, and it's integrated with the AbilityNet Regional Adjustment Service to create the trust, to provide extensive candidate and employee resources so everybody goes off learning more about themselves and the adjustment options available to them. It gives guidance at every stage in the journey, builds that confidence to create that disability confident and competent employer. And the key here, whether it's Clear Talents or it's whether your internal process or it's an external process that you're using, it's not good enough to just put a strapline on a website or to just ask the question once. We have to ask it once, twice, again and again, so that we are covered under the Equality Act for having planned for, preempted and proactively provided regional adjustment support. I suspect many of you listening in will be in the reactive space, and that's fine. That's where lots of people are, where somebody asks for an adjustment and you rattle around trying to find out, well, how can I provide that adjustment? The law says you need to preempt that. So you need to be driving change through your organisation so that people share information with you and empower you then to deliver those adjustments, which are often soft adjustments around working hours or working practices, and transform the lives of the individual and your productivity. So if you want to just whiz on, Mark, because I'm conscious of time.
Yeah.
That's just it's a screenshot actually of the Clear Talents resource, and that's just so that you can ask yourself some questions actually, because the sort of questions you need to be asking your employees are around how they communicate, how they use pen and paper, how they use technology, how they operate around their workspace, i.e. around their desk and their workstations, and their workplace, so the whole building environment, travelling around, and also the opportunity to tell them more about information that might impact, whether that's about caring responsibilities or whether that's around disability, or actually whether that's around religious belief, culture, gender reassignment, anything in terms of life circumstances that you as an employer can fully support, is worth exploring with all of your employees and all of your candidates, not just those who are coming forward and saying I have a disability. Everybody, so that we get to that 1 in 4. Thank you.
Great, thanks. That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Kate. And just to emphasise that the Clear Talent tool that Kate's described there, the reason we're talking about it is we've worked together on this. It's actually built into our service, and so we use it to ask the right questions and support staff. I have a question just before we go, Kate, or before we go on this bit. Would epilepsy be considered for reasonable adjustments in the workforce? Somebody has asked.
Well, the answer is yes and no. So if the epilepsy had an impact on somebody in the workplace, and whether that's about health and safety and colleagues knowing, whether it's about reducing stress or lighting, or facilities management or time at work without breaks, and I'm sure lots of other things, then those adjustments should be known about, explored, discussed and made in order for that individual to perform well at work, and epilepsy is covered under the Equality Act.
Great, thank you. I'm also just going to launch a poll just for a moment. I'm going to ask you how well do you think your organisation manager's disclosure. So you should have a poll up now saying whether you think it's done not very well, okay. It's a very crude question, but just a way for us to understand how well you think you're doing at the moment. And I can see 60% of you have voted, 70%. I'll give you another few seconds. Hopefully you can see that and click on it. And great, we're getting up to 90% now. So that seems like everybody who's going to vote has voted. I'll close that poll and share the results. It shows that 47% of you think you're doing okay, 32% think you're doing very well, and 3% not at all, and 3% not sure. So skewed towards people thinking they're doing okay at this task of how well do you think your organisation handles disclosure. Okay, so moving on. Next, Robin, you're going to give us some examples of reasonable adjustments. We've got 3 here that we're going to talk through. Can I hand over to you then?
Great. So the first one we've got here, Dan. So here he says that despite best efforts, he has actually on arriving at venues, not just for in this case he's talking about going for an interview, but you know he gets this on a regular basis. That despite flagging in advance, Dan has no issues with disclosure. He finds himself having to be stuck. There's no disabled bay. There's no access. There's only stair access up to a venue, and so he has to call from the car park to say, I can't get in, and they have to sort of rush around, as Kate said, and make quick, reasonable adjustments. So, whereas clear talents that Kate's outlined a moment ago by no means is the only way of asking your applicants, your candidates or your employees all the right questions so that you can plan and be preemptive. Certainly it's a very useful way. So we talked a moment ago about epilepsy, and photosensitive epilepsy is certainly covered in clear talents, so that if a candidate is coming for an interview, not only will they have been asked all the right questions to supportively disclose any needs they may have. They include, for example, if there are videos playing in the lobby of your building, and they might have flashing or strobing or some effects that might be injurious to people with photosensitive epilepsy, then they're able to flag those. So it burrows or buries right down into do you need a prayer room, have you got a nut allergy, all that sort of thing. So as I say, it's by no means the only way of asking this. It's just a very neat way of asking all the right questions in the right way, so that you can get the information that you need, so that you're not sort of rushing around at the last minute, or heaven forbid, trying to deal with a very serious situation that has arisen because the right questions weren't asked at every stage during the process. If we go on to the next slide, Mark, if you could just read out the quote, please.
Do you want me to read it, Robin?
Yep, we've got no mark.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so Sheila cares for her young disabled child, which has caused some difficulties in terms of her availability. And she says, I valued the opportunity to discuss my situation with my employer, and I can now commit to working hours that suit everyone.
Thanks. Kate was my reasonable adjustment there, because I'm a blind screen reader user myself, and reading a large chunk of text like that would require me remembering an awful lot, and my brain just isn't up to it, I'm afraid. So thank you there, reasonable adjustment. So yeah, this is somebody who, the reasonable adjustment in this case was flexibility around working patterns, and all of the reasonable adjustments, all of the areas of discrimination are as broad as, there are as many different requirements as there are people in your workforce. So, but they're all, the vast majority are ones that can readily be accommodated and put in place for little or no expense. And obviously there's a disabled child in this scenario, which if your employees themselves aren't impacted by impairment or disability, it's worth noting that under the Discrimination Act, someone like this who has a caring responsibility for someone with a disability is covered as well. If we go on to the last one.
Would you like me to read this one? Sorry,
Yes, please.
I was muted because there was loads of noise in the background here. Katrina Ostrowski, I have slight hearing loss and have been getting headaches as a result of having to concentrate on what people are saying to me, especially in a noisy environment. Clear Talents includes an online hearing test which identified a hearing problem. It also recommended a visit from an AbilityNet assessor. It was good to speak to an expert about simple changes we could make to my workplace, like a headset for being on the phone and a quieter environment to work in.
Great. So we've mentioned the workplace assessment service that AbilityNet offers, and AbilityNet assessors can come into the workplace, can do an expert assessment. We do remote assessments as well, which are particularly lend themselves to people with dyslexia, and they can be very readily booked in and delivered at very little cost, way below what Access to Work assessment costs, for example. And here we've got Katrina, who just needed a few simple adjustments. And were you to use Clear Talents on the front end of the process, then there is a simple link within those areas of the report that are indicating that somebody might benefit from an expert external assessment, where you can just, with a single click, fill out a form to book an AbilityNet assessment for them to come to the workplace or to do it remotely. One fantastic resource, which is linked to from various places within Clear Talents, but it's also a standalone sort of micro site, or quite large site really on its own. If we go to the next slide, it's called My Computer My Way, and this is something that AbilityNet have developed. Feel free to all link to it. It's abilitynet.org.uk/myway.
mycomputermyway.com.
Oh,
you probably
okay. Newsflash. And here we can see those categories of impairment. Actually, I don't know what the slide is, but those are the 4 main categories of impairment, and it covers all the different areas, all the different platforms, Windows, all the different main platforms, Windows, Macintosh, iOS, the iPhone, Android, and Windows Phone as well. And in there, you've got all the different accessibility features of how to customize your device, your platform, to best suit your needs, from mouse acceleration and double click speed, how to change things on screen. On mobile phones is all the sort of high contrast settings, the ability to have it speak to you, to speak to it, all of those things. So we would invite people to go and have a look at that after you get off the webinar, or just point your employees at My Computer My Way, and many reasonable adjustments will unfold to people who have been struggling in using their technology without you having to assist them in that way, because it's all nicely laid out there.
Great, thank you, Robin. I've got a couple of questions. We have about 5 minutes to get into the 45-minute slot. So I've got a couple of questions. If you do have any questions, please post up on the questions slot. As I said, I've got 2 here, and if they come in, I'll just handle those as people are answering them. So the first one is, would you recommend that agreed reasonable adjustments are recorded in some way? I'm assuming both of you would agree that, so I don't know. Would you like to describe how that's done within the tool, Kate?
Yeah, although actually AbilityNet are using it probably closer than I am, but I can do that with pleasure. Yeah, absolutely would record that for a number of reasons. One is that you want to build on your knowledge. 2 is that you want to have a temperature test of the reasonable adjustment requirements in your organisation. And actually another reason is that we get trends developing, so you can pick up where everybody's asking for different lighting at their desk, and suddenly you realise that in fact a blind in that open plan office might make the lighting better for everybody. So you can view those trends and so on. And the way that works on Clear Talents is that as an employee you have a dashboard which shows your adjustment provision and the ratings of those provisions from obviously moderate, minor, moderate and severe, in the different business units so that you can map that, and you can also map how quickly the provision is delivered. Because what I meant to mention and didn't, so forgive me, is that one of the other challenges you can face around regional adjustments is that you can have the conversation, you can identify the adjustment requirements, but you need a really slick process behind it to deliver that adjustment in a timely and effective way. And again, I would recommend organisations have a process for monitoring that. Very big project across the civil service. All government departments have been through a huge analysis on this. It pinpointed some very specific areas of improvement that they've been able to put in place by having that data.
Great, thank you very much.
Welcome.
Another question, which I've heard a few times, is how do you ensure non-disabled staff do not feel as though disabled staff are being treated better than them? I don't know, Robin, do you want to take that one?
I think that if you broaden the conversation out from disability and you talk about diversity, and one of the approaches that we would advocate, certainly this is what you would do with clear talents, and if you were doing a similar process that wasn't specifically clear talents, but it was a questionnaire, for example, something where you're trying to, I mean, you'd have to do this very carefully, but if you cover all areas of diversity, all the protected characteristics, as they're called under the Equality Act, then everybody would be included in the process. Everybody would have a voice. Everybody would be encouraged to disclose that they had, you know, wrist pain, eye strain on a Friday afternoon, times of the day where they wouldn't like to be contacted by colleagues because they need to focus on their work. There are so many areas of diversity. It's not just about disability. And then everybody is included in the process. The recommendations, the reasonable adjustments are provided to everybody, and everybody has a voice. So, you know, that I think is one of the sort of the beauty of the approach of clear talents. And if that can be, if that challenge can be met in your internal processes with or without clear talents, then that would be by far the sort of best scenario.
Great, thank you.
Mark, may I add to that very briefly?
Yeah.
Agreeing with everything that Robin said, absolutely. But also it's about how you communicate what you're doing. So any reasonable adjustment provision, there needs to be some dialogue around, is there an opportunity to involve the team, brief the team so that everybody understands what adjustments are being made and why. And it's also very empowering for an organisation to know when and how to say no, so that it doesn't become the disabled person asks for a new chair and automatically gets it. There has to be that, you know, the adjustment has to have the impact and be reasonable.
Great, thank you. I've got a point in here as well. I just want to add in, time's rushing on, but Carol, you mentioned the application form only in the process is discriminatory to dyslexic people. It should be either a form or CV and cover letter. The Equality Act says you don't have to disclose, so why should a dyslexic person have to disclose to get an adjustment of sending a CV? That's a good point, thank you. And I know there are other points that people have made, and we'll try and round those up. I'm pushing on because we've nearly run out of time. I just want to round up the 5 points, and Kate, could you just run us through? These are what you said were the 5 points that every HR professional needs to know. So
definitely, and also I'll pick up on that last point that's been very well made by the individual around dyslexia, because our stance on regional adjustment provision is that yes, we want to encourage people to disclose, but not necessarily to disclose their impairment or condition. What all we need to know about is there an impact that our processes have that we can adjust to improve your experience during those. So you don't need to tell me that you have dyslexia. You do need, it would be really helpful if you felt able to tell us that having a different colour screen or having an offline process or talking to someone in advance of an interview made an impact for you. So I think that's really key, that employers' position why they're asking for information isn't about disclosure, it's about the provision of adjustments, and that's so important. And to get that right, you need to plan ahead, because last-minute adjustments need to be as good as planned adjustments according to the Equality Act, so there isn't an excuse to do them last minute. Asking the right questions at the right time, involving the individual, and then asking them again. So issues around the dyslexia comment that's just been made there, it's not good enough to just say, do you want adjustments? It's not good enough to just say the application form. It's repeatedly asking all the way through, is there anything we can do to improve this experience for you? Building that confidence in the stakeholders, when to say yes, when to say no, how to ask the questions, who to ask when in doubt. And above all, if you're going to have a reasonable adjustment provision, and clearly you should, make sure it's effective and keep measuring that and take feedback on it.
Great, thank you very much indeed. And I certainly something I've picked up, which hasn't been mentioned, so I will just put it in there about asking the questions again. Is of course that people's lives change, and their point about 50% of people acquire their disability whilst of working age. It's a movable feast. It's a continual process. Your vision may be reducing as you go over time, and therefore new reasonable adjustments are required. So that one really struck me when we were going over the background information. So finally, we've got an opportunity if people are interested. Clear Talents thing is obviously something that we've been working on with Clear. That's why Kate's here. If anybody would like to try out the Clear Talents process, they can contact Kate or Robin. The email addresses are up here: kate.headley@theclearcompany.co.uk or robin.christopherson@abilitynet.org.uk. You can put some real employees through the process and understand what those questions, the power of the questions, and the ability to get more feedback than you are at the moment. And then if you'd like to, or if you find the telephone easier to use, then 01926 465 247, give us a call. Finally, the general contact details are up there again, but also we have an AbilityNet webinar next week, an exciting one for us. Barclays is one of our clients, and they're going to be talking about how they've made the business case for accessibility, which is a significant thing for them. That's a board level commitment to accessibility as one of the core strands in their business strategy, which is a huge change in how this big multinational business is seeing accessibility. And then equally, in a couple of weeks' time, Dyslexia in the Workplace is Dyslexia Awareness Week. We're going to do an event around dyslexia in the workplace. There's also one about dyslexia in education, and the following week there will be about digital design for dyslexia. And you can see all of those details at abilitynet.org.uk/webinars. So thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you very much, Kate, for your time and your huge expertise, for giving us a sort of a more complete picture of the need for reasonable adjustments and how to manage that. We do hope you found it useful. The video of the event will be circulated soon, and also some follow-up notes. If you have any questions at all, please do get in touch. Thank you, Robin, and thank you all for joining us.